What do you do for fun?
I have to say, politics is fun for me. I ski. I own a heli ski lodge, and I love to go skiing. I think I own the best ski resort in the world. It's a boutique hotel. It is the most remote lodge with all the comforts of the internet and so on and so forth that you could ever be at. The terrain in the Caribou Mountains, I think, is the best ski terrain in the world. So I like to do that. I like to golf a bit. I just had a medical miracle. I had 2 new hips put in this year. I'm slightly apprehensive, but also optimistic that I'm going to be back skiing and golfing, and once again, a young man, you know?
I was fascinated with Conrad Black. I remember you were so intrigued with him. I find your curiosity fascinating because you're fascinated with everybody, and it doesn't matter who they are. You're intrigued by it.
I think Conrad Black is one of Canada's treasures, and of course, there's been a lot of controversy around it. But he is just one of these incredible, genuine, and giant intellects. And I've just never had a conversation with him that isn't fascinating. I'm not sure I could quickly name another speaker who can be talking in a somewhat lecturing style with his historical references for an hour and still have the audience completely engaged, nobody on their cell phone. I've seen him talk to audiences of 1,000 people, of 100 people. He has an incredible ability to engage. I just think he's incredible, incredibly interesting. Getting back to the conversation about the public square and making sure that we are talking with each other as opposed to polarizing into our own camps. You define yourself by your differences, but as an Albertan, I have way more in common than we have different.
To your point, we have to find common ground. You have to sit down with people you disagree with and hear them out.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping that comes back. Here's the part that I'm really pissed at Trudeau. I would make the argument that Trump and him had a kind of a good relationship. I really think a lot of this is just that Trump is pissed at Trudeau, how he feels disrespected by someone he actually had a good relationship with.
I do find interesting parallels to the Pierre Trudeau prime ministership and the Justin Trudeau prime ministership. There's a bit of I'm following in my father's footsteps type of thing. And it may just be that Justin Trudeau's wanting to sort of pick up his father's legacy and achieve it maybe better than Pierre did. But if you remember, Trudeau was the first prime minister who was publicly disrespectful to a U.S. president and publicly disrespectful to the Queen of England, doing the pirouette behind her back, remember? So I just sort of feel to some extent that maybe Justin's in that sort of position of playing to that same crowd. And maybe in his own mind, as I think Pierre Trudeau thought at the time, this was a sense of Canada being equal to these other nations, that we don't bend the knee to them. And we might be in a bit of a problem where Trump is saying we are going to rebuild the sort of McKinley-Monroe type doctrine of North America is America's sphere of influence. And we might find that in our current prime minister, this sort of sense of, like Pierre Trudeau, I'm sorry, I'm going to thumb my nose at you. Canada's independent. Canada's a strong nation ourselves, and we don't kowtow to Americans.
Why aren't we more connected to England? We're Commonwealth. We have the same head of state. We're connected, but we're not connected. I mean, they have a pretty big economy. Why don't we strengthen the relationship? Why aren't we supplying them with oil?
It's important for us to understand historically, Canada, we were a French nation for almost 200 years before we became an English one, right? So there's a very deep and important French history to this country, including here, like the Fort Chip was French fur traders. I suspect that we would be a lot more like Australia if we didn't have Quebec, that there would be just, that English Commonwealth pride. I think that the Quebec nationalism struggles with the idea of being part of a British Commonwealth. And I think that when you have a prime minister from Quebec who the political base to actually be the prime minister is strongly in Quebec, it becomes hard for him to have those close relationships. We saw that with Pierre Trudeau. We didn't see it with Brian Mulroney. But, Brian, I think, was more of an Anglophone from Quebec, right?
It was, yeah. What is next for advocacy?
I remind people that in 2015, the cultural narrative of Canada was that we had the dirtiest oil in the world. Europe was trying to ban not oil, Canadian oil, because it was perceived globally to be the dirtiest in the world. And the other one is the First Nations, and I know you're close to that. The narrative was that the oil and gas industry and the resources industry in general just were exploiting First Nations lands, and that the First Nations were struggling to just protect nature and protect the land. But this has changed dramatically. And work from people like you talking about actually our world-leading environmental standards and technologies has really changed these narratives, including the publicity, both by us and First Nations, of the respectful involvement that they have in our industry, almost unlike any other. So this has completely changed the narrative. I'm for export-based environmental policies. I'm for doubling our aluminum production, which is the lowest emissions in the world. I'm for doubling our grains production, which is among the lowest emissions in the world. I'm for producing double the amount of gas. I'm not sure we could, but if we could, I'd be for it. Because if we could just export more best in the world products from an environmental point of view, then I think this is incredible comparative advantage in carbon that Canada has, we could reduce more than 100% of all of Canada's emissions with an export-based policy. I think that the door is maybe reopened. Suddenly people are listening to things that I've said for 8 years. And I think there's also an opening to reopen the infrastructure for Canada to be able to get its products to market. There's an opportunity out of crisis, an opportunity out of the threat. And I'm hopeful it'll be positive for advocacy. And maybe we'll find some of these pragmatic environmentalists that are starting to realize, hey, maybe we need to reset on net zero, for example. We need to actually start moving towards pragmatic solutions that make real differences to the global environment. And if some of those pragmatic environmentalists would join with progressive oil and gas people, which I'd argue I mostly am, that want to solve some of these environmental problems, I think there could be a breakthrough.
I've never seen you attack another form of energy. Lots of us go after windmills or solar, and you don't.
I will often say, hey, just a second, let's realize there's some real costs here too, not just benefits. And because the debate and the conversation is so one-sided, often I find myself talking like I'm against windmills because I'm just pointing out the problems, but I'm not really against them. I'm just saying, let's make a best energy in its best place decision. And you can't do that unless you're honest and open about both the benefits and the impacts. And let's also be clear, the cost of wind and solar keeps coming down dramatically. There's something happening that makes the price of electricity keep going up. And we all know what it is. It's the system charge. Wind and solar have got their primary production costs down to fairly competitive prices now. What none of them want to talk about is the impact they have on the system. And their impact on the system creates a lot more transmission lines, a lot more grid instability. They cause a lot of problems for the system, and they're not being charged for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.